In the heart of a small, abandoned town stood an old, weathered hotel, the Ravenwood Hotel. Once a thriving establishment, it had long since fallen into ruin, its windows boarded up and its front steps rotting away. The hotel had been the center of social life in the town decades ago, but after a tragic incident, it was abandoned, and the townsfolk left it to decay. The story began when a young couple, Emily and Mark, decided to take a detour during their road trip and stay at the notorious hotel. They had heard rumors about the place, whispers of a restless spirit haunting the halls, but they laughed it off as just another local legend. The hotel, despite its dilapidated state, was an eerie place, and there was something about the way the air seemed to grow heavier as they crossed the threshold. Still, they checked in, and the clerk, an elderly man who spoke little, gave them a room on the third floor, where the stories always seemed to originate. As the sun set and the hotel grew darker, they explored their surroundings, the air smelling of dust and mildew. Despite the discomfort, they decided to stay the night. What they didn't know was that their presence had disturbed something in the hotel, a presence that had been waiting for years. The first strange occurrence happened around midnight. Emily was in the bathroom, brushing her teeth, when she heard a soft knock on the door. Thinking it was Mark, she opened it, but no one was there. The hallway outside was dark and empty, and the air was unnervingly cold. She shrugged it off as a trick of the wind and returned to the room. But the second knock came, louder this time, more insistent. Mark, who had been reading on the bed, looked up, his face pale. He had heard it too. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tense. Emily nodded, her heart beginning to race. The knocks continued for several minutes, growing more erratic, as though something, was trying to get inside. The couple tried to convince themselves it was nothing, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. They locked the door and pulled the covers over their heads, but sleep never came. The next morning, Emily and Mark tried to forget about the strange events of the night before. The sun was shining, and the hotel seemed quieter in the daylight, almost welcoming. They ventured out to explore the town, but the more they learned about the history of the Ravenwood Hotel, the more they became intrigued by its dark past. According to the locals, the hotel had once been a luxurious retreat for the wealthy. But one fateful night, a fire had broken out on the third floor, claiming the lives of several guests. It was rumored that one of the victims, a woman named Catherine Blackwood, had perished in the fire, and her spirit had never left the hotel. Locals spoke of hearing her mournful cries at night, and some claimed to have seen her ghostly figure wandering the halls. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she heard the whispers. They began faintly at first, but soon they grew louder, coming from all around her. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing and speaking in a language she could not understand. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark was fast asleep, oblivious to the eerie sounds filling the room. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Emily lay there in the dark, her mind racing. Was she imagining things? Or had something truly disturbed the silence of the hotel? The following night, Emily could no longer ignore the unsettling feeling that had been creeping up on her since their arrival. She awoke to a strange sight. Mark was standing in front of the old, cracked mirror across the room, staring intently at his reflection. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Mark?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. She slowly approached him, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the room. As she reached out to touch his shoulder, she gasped. His skin was cold, and his body was stiff, like he wasn't fully there. Suddenly, he jerked back to life, his eyes snapping open. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, his voice hoarse. "Mark, you were just standing there, staring at the mirror. Are you okay?" Emily asked, confused and frightened. "I don't know," he whispered, still visibly shaken. There was something in the reflection. It wasn't me. It was her. Emily felt her blood run cold. Mark had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but now he seemed terrified. He explained that, for a split second, he had seen a woman standing behind him in the mirror, a woman with dark, sorrowful eyes. When he turned around, she was gone. Emily's mind raced. Could it have been Catherine Blackwood? Was her spirit somehow reaching out to them? The following day, Emily and Mark made the decision to explore the third floor, where the fire had begun. The door to the floor had been locked, but with a little persistence, they managed to get inside. The hallway was dark, filled with remnants of the hotel's former grandeur, old carpets, crumbling wallpaper, and shattered light fixtures. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and decay. They walked down the long hallway, the eerie silence pressing in around them. As they approached the far end of the hall, Emily felt a sudden chill, and the temperature dropped several degrees in an instant. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls. Suddenly, Mark froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his face turning white. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, though there was no one else in sight. They turned, but the hall remained empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if something was approaching. Emily's heart raced as she grabbed Mark's arm. "We need to leave," she said urgently. But before they could move, the door to room 307 swung open on its own, creaking loudly in the silence. Emily and Mark exchanged a look, both terrified, but unable to resist the pull of curiosity. Inside the room, they found the remnants of a lavish bedroom, a four-poster bed with broken furniture scattered across the floor. But what caught their attention was the large portrait on the wall. It was a painting of a woman, her face hauntingly familiar. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. It was Catherine Blackwood. Just then, a cold breeze rushed past them, and the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The temperature plummeted, and the faint sound of crying echoed in the room. Emily and Mark rushed for the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Emily and Mark desperately tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Their hearts were pounding wildly. A hum echoed in their ears, and it seemed as though the very atmosphere was closing in on them. The room began to darken slowly, and suddenly they heard footsteps. A figure appeared from the dark corner of the room. It was a woman, her eyes filled with sorrow, and her form barely distinguishable in the dim light. She wasn't walking, rather, she was hovering over the floor as if not touching the ground at all. Emily screamed and stepped back, but Mark grabbed her hand. "Don't look into her eyes," he whispered. The figure moved closer, and Emily felt an icy chill constricting her body. The ghost of Catherine Blackwood slowly approached, her eyes burning with a painful light. "Help me." Her voice was barely audible, but the words penetrated their minds like a whisper in the dark. Emily felt her mind starting to cloud. She could barely stand, and only Mark, holding her hand, kept her from collapsing. The ghost extended her translucent hand, but Emily struggled to tear her gaze away from her eyes. "She doesn't want to kill us," Emily whispered, but her words felt foreign, as though they were not her own. "She wants us to help her," Mark added, still not understanding what exactly needed to be done. At that moment, the figure vanished, dissolving into the air, and the room returned to its oppressive, shadowed state. The door, which had been locked before, suddenly slammed open. Without a word, Emily and Mark grabbed each other's hands and rushed into the corridor. Emily and Mark ran into the corridor, but even here, they didn't feel safe. The temperature continued to drop, and their breath became visible in the air. Every shadow seemed alive, and every step echoed as if the hotel itself were watching them. They decided to return to the town and find a local historian or elder who might know more about the place. However, on their way, they once again encountered Catherine's ghost. She wasn't aggressive, but in her eyes was an expression of pain, longing, and a need for help. Despite her fear, Emily decided to approach. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice trembling. The ghost pointed a finger toward an old staircase leading down to the basement and vanished into the fog. Emily and Mark silently headed toward the basement, each step growing more difficult. Fear and cold intensified with every passing moment. They descended the old steps, covered in moss and dampness, into the dark, forgotten basement. In the center of the basement stood an old wooden table, surrounded by dark corners and the musty air. It was so silent here that even their footsteps seemed too loud. On the table lay an ancient manuscript. It was a book of spells, dated from the 18th century. The language it was written in was old and hard to understand, but just one page was enough for Emily to make out its meaning. It was a spell that could break the curse placed on the hotel. Emily and Mark decided they had to try performing the spell. But for that, they needed to return to the room where they were staying and find specific symbols that were part of the ritual. The manuscript spoke of symbols that needed to be drawn on the walls and floor in a particular sequence. They returned to their room, feeling the darkness creeping deeper into their souls. The same whisper Emily had heard in the basement was now echoing in their minds. The room was completely dark, and they could barely see each other. But glowing symbols began to appear on the walls, symbols they were meant to follow. Using whatever they had on hand, they began drawing these symbols on the floor and walls. As soon as they finished the last symbol, the air around them filled once again with the same cold. A faint smell of burning wood lingered in the air, and even their shadows seemed to begin moving. "This isn't what we thought," Mark said, his voice laced with panic. "This isn't a banishment spell." But it was too late. The words they had spoken began to come to life. They felt the ground beneath them starting to tremble. The walls shifted, the floor sank, and suddenly, a blinding light appeared in the center of the room. When the light faded, something terrifying manifested in the room. It was not quite a creature, more like a manifestation of all the pain and fears that had accumulated in the hotel. It was dark, with jagged eyes that reflected all the suffering of Catherine Blackwood. It was neither alive nor dead, and a single glance at it could drain their last strength. Mark tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't obey. Emily grabbed his hand. "The spell, we need to finish it," she whispered. But before they could complete the ritual, the creature lunged at them. It wasn't a fight, it was the realization of the end. Dark hands squeezed around their throats, the cold and death looming over them. But suddenly, the light returned, and Catherine Blackwood's figure appeared before them. She was no longer ominous, on the contrary, her face glowed with gratitude. The creature vanished, and the hotel fell silent again. When Emily and Mark returned the next day, they couldn't find the hotel. It was gone. Where the eerie building once stood, there was only empty land. Occasionally, when the wind started playing with the leaves, they could hear a strange, faint whisper coming from that spot. The town had no memory of the Ravenwood Hotel, and no one knew what had once happened within its walls. But those who dared to approach that corner spoke of strange tales about how the cold winds carried with them an echo of the past, an echo that would never disappear. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and watch my other videos.